Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. As Sarah mentioned, the title of our project is Using Ensemble Methods for Computational Redistricting. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we generally refer to ourselves as the redistricting team. My name is Ryan Gorn, and I'm joined today by the three other fellows, Rowana Ahmed, Catherine Chang, and Michael Suffrant. Our project lead is Daryl DeFord, and the data scientists advising our team are Vaughn Iverson and Bernice Herman. Today, we're going to be sharing with you the outputs of our work over the last 10 weeks and how we see this timely project fitting into the congressional redistricting process that is currently happening. Of the 435 seats that make up the US House of Representatives, 89% of them are currently considered safe. This means that in what is purportedly one of the most democratic nations in the world, only 11% of elected representatives are likely to be voted out of office. Meanwhile, Americans' approval rating of how well Congress represents them has averaged less than 20% over the last decade. And yet, nearly 90% of their seats are unlikely to change hands. This reality fundamentally undermines both the spirit and practice of democracy. A major reason for how we arrived at this representational disconnect is through the strategic manipulation of electoral districts. Under the current system, politicians have been allowed to pick their voters rather than voters picking their politicians, a practice which runs counter to everything that democracy is supposed to embody. The manipulation of electoral district boundaries for personal or partisan gain is commonly called gerrymandering. Though it is most often talked about in terms of partisan outcomes, racial gerrymandering to dilute or suppress the voices of certain demographic groups also frequently occurs, either by clustering those groups together to limit the number of seats they can get, or by separating them into many districts to dilute their votes. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this concept, but a bit of background is warranted to understand exactly how this process works and why it has become so prone to partisan exploitation. The Constitution mandates that the population of the US be regularly counted and that changes in the population be used to reapportion the seats of the House of Representatives so they remain proportionally distributed within and across states. Thus, every 10 years after the census, all 50 states must engage in a process of redistricting, or redrawing the geographic boundaries of their congressional districts. Importantly, this process is largely controlled by state legislatures, who either draw new district boundaries themselves or refer the process to a committee of their choosing. Each state has its own rules for this process, and there are always trade-offs that must be considered when dividing up a state into electoral districts. But since district boundaries have so much power to shape the dynamics of political representation and influence the outcome of future elections, this is always a contentious and politically charged process, which creates incentives for gerrymandering. Though gerrymandering has been a persistent problem in the United States for over 200 years, as this graph shows, the problem is getting worse. On the y-axis, you can see the number of seats in the House, and on the x-axis, the time since 1997. The two solid vertical lines are census years, which mark when district boundaries are redrawn, and the dotted vertical lines is the first congressional election using those new maps. So as you can see, after new maps were adopted in the last 2 cycles, we see a notable increase in safe seats for both major political parties and a corresponding decrease in the number of competitive seats in the purple. In large part, this is because both major political parties have become increasingly adept at using computational geospatial mapping tools and voter databases to create safe districts for political parties and individual politicians with high accuracy. In an intensely polarized political climate, neither major party is likely to unilaterally disarm by refusing to gerrymander when they have the power to do so. Thus, we are unlikely to arrive at a political solution to this problem. Instead, we need to democratize the process of redistricting and empower citizen groups, activists, and nonpartisan map drawing commissions to become more involved, to monitor redistricting committees and the maps that they produce for potential gerrymandering before they are adopted, or to challenge the maps in courts that give outsized influence to some while diminishing the democratic voice of others. This has been the primary motivation for our work this summer. The current redistricting cycle is the first in which computational tools designed to assist with this process have been developed and made publicly available. So our focus as data scientists interested in making a social good impact has been to democratize access to one of these computational redistricting tools in particular, GerryChain. In the rest of the presentation, we're going to briefly explain why GerryChain is such a powerful tool for computational redistricting, summarize the insights we gained from applying GerryChain to unique redistricting problems in 3 states, And finally, discuss the user guide we developed to help make this tool more accessible to the general public.
So before diving into the details of GerryChain, let's first look at a toy example on the process of drawing district maps. If we consider a 5x5 grid and we try to segment it into 5 districts that are each contiguous and composed of 5 blocks, you could see that just a single 5-block district that starts at the top right-hand corner can take 35 different shapes. If we fill out the grid and draw 5 contiguous districts of 5 squares each, then there become 4,006 different maps that we can draw. As you can imagine in the real world, the problem explodes in complexity. For example, Washington State has 4,667 voting precincts that need to be partitioned into 10 districts, much larger than a 5x5 grid. In fact, computational redistricting experts have stated that the real number of possible district plans for any state would be greater than all the atoms in the known universe. So to explore this giant universe of potential maps, we use Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling methods, or MCMC. The idea behind a Markov chain is based on a random walk. Here, you have a sequence of states where the next state only depends on your previous state, so there is no long-term history. And the more steps one takes, the more configuration in the state space we explore. We then collect the plans visited at each step to create a distribution of possible plans. To illustrate this example, let's use our 5x5 grid and choose a starting plan, which lies at the center of this visualization. This is the first step of our Markov chain. Here, there are 4 different paths that can be taken from our initial starting plan. These 4 potential paths are within the state space of different configurations, but is not exhaustive. One path is randomly selected with our random walk, which moves us to our second step. In the second step, we can make a minor modification to the plan and then randomly select a plan to move us to the third step and repeat the process. The more steps we take, the more configurations in the state space we explore. So using MCMC, we can effectively sample from the universe of potential maps. And we could generate ensembles of potential districting maps using GerryChain. GerryChain is a Python library written and managed by the Metric, Geometry, and Gerrymandering Group, or MGGG, at Tufts University, and worked on extensively by our project lead, Daryl DeFord. Moving beyond our 5x5 grid, let's look at a real-world example in the state of Virginia. Now, Virginia has a bit more than 2,400 voting precincts that need to be partitioned into 11 congressional districts. Using GerryChain, we ran a Markov chain for 100 steps. This GIF shows the map generated at each step of the chain. Typically, the type of proposal you see here requires about 10,000 steps before reaching a steady state distribution, while other proposals may require millions. After we finish running our chain, we can then plot the distribution of statistics of interest drawn from all the maps within our ensemble. So in sum, MCMC and GerryChain allow us to capture the distribution of a sample from the universe of potential plans, which can help establish ensemble means, detect outliers, and evaluate current human-generated plans. So while GerryChain was developed to lower the barrier of entry for the use of computational redistricting tools, as with any tool, its use requires careful thought and consideration to realize its full potential. In this section, we'll discuss 3 important considerations relative to state-specific applications of MCMC and GerryChain. Our work here informed our stakeholder guide deliverable, which assists interested users who aim to conduct similar analyses. Now, the map drawing process and legal rules for redistricting differ for each state. However, states share many similar redistricting rules. Here, we have the 9 most common rules, such as equal population balance, the preservation of political boundaries, such as city or county lines. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk about all of them today, so we highlighted 3 specific rules. We'll discuss how we examine political competitiveness in Colorado, partisan considerations in Georgia, and the Voting Rights Act compliance in Texas. In using GerryChain, our first task is to translate legal language governing state-level redistricting into quantifiable measures. Colorado has language in their state constitution specifically highlighting that proposed district plans should, quote, to the extent possible, maximize the number of politically competitive districts. However, first we must address, how do we define political competitiveness? There are many different ways to define competitiveness, and there is no prevailing agreed upon standard. Today, I'll focus on just one approach, a commonly used method called the vote band. The vote band method outlines that a district is considered competitive if its Democratic and Republican vote share falls within a specific range. There are two commonly used ranges, 46.5 to 53.5% and 45 to 55%. Here, we pause to make a decision. Do we consider competitive districts to be between 46.5 to 53.5 or 45 to 55%? We selected the 45 to 55% vote band because it aligns with existing published literature and is the band most relevant to our Colorado context. So now we could set up a neutral ensemble that maximizes the number of competitive districts in Colorado. Now, in the past 5 US House elections in Colorado, using the 2012 map, only one of the 7 districts was considered competitive. Using Jerry chain, we designed a Markov chain to follow specific constraints and acceptance conditions. So it generates plans that follow a state's legal redistricting rule. That is, in Colorado, we specifically designed the Markov chain to only accept the next steps in the chain that contain plans with a greater or same number of competitive districts. We ran the chain for 10,000 steps and graphed the number of competitive districts contained in each plan explored. Here, you could see that our ensemble mean is 4 districts, which is 3 more districts than the 2012 human-generated plan. So our takeaway from this analysis is that any Colorado district plan only containing 1 competitive district can serve as an outlier, and that Colorado map drawers can aim to construct maps that have up to 4 competitive US congressional districts.
Now we're going to focus on partisan considerations as one of the many guidelines of the redistricting rules in Georgia, which also requires that state legislative district be contiguous and the compactness of redistricting maps. As such, the green boxes shown here represent the main parameters that are considered in the redistricting rules of Georgia, and the gray boxes represent guidelines that are not as highlighted for the state. Since state rules aim to achieve a total population that is substantially equal per district, the outcome of the election in terms of the political parties involved is critical. As such, we'll probe one of the built-in metrics of Jerry chain as an example to evaluate partisan outcomes. So the metric we want to focus on is the wasted votes assessment. Wasted votes, by definition, are any votes cast for either party in excess to the 50% needed to win. Let's consider this particular set of plans, which shows 3 possible redistricting plans for the same distribution of voters. Each box represents a voter. The stars represent the A party voters, and B party voters are shown as blank. Plan 1, colored in red, shows a competitive and fair plan. So we end up with a proper distribution of votes among districts, with 3 districts favoring each party A and party B. Plan 2, colored in green, shows cracked districts, with 5 districts favoring party A and 1 district favoring party B. As shown in Plan 2, the 1 district which favors party B shows wasted votes in regard to the party, since A voters are spread among several adjacent districts and B voters are condensed into 1 district. Plan 3, colored in blue, shows packed districts, with 3 districts favoring each party A and party B. In Plan 3, both A and B parties show wasted votes since voters are condensed into their respective districts. Now that we've defined the wasted votes metric and its distribution along the set of plans, we're going to focus on the approach to generate and evaluate wasted votes count per district of the state. So the state of Georgia is composed of 14 districts with 58% under the control of the Republican Party, which raises questions concerning fair voting and voting outcomes. So the first step of our analysis involved generating an ensemble of proposed plans through Jerry chain. Then we measure the wasted votes count per district per party for each plan within the ensemble. We then take a state perspective by calculating the total wasted votes count along the ensemble to generate the percentage of wasted votes for either party. Afterwards, we take a district perspective by averaging the wasted votes count for each district along the ensemble to calculate the percentage of wasted votes for either party. As such, we'll ultimately compare wasted votes percentage with the 2011 enacted plan of Georgia using the 2016 presidential election data. Looking at the state, we can first see the total wasted votes percentages of the 2011 enacted plan of Georgia for both the Republican Party and Democratic parties, which also reflects the control of the Republican Party on the state. The percentage of wasted votes for the Republican Party was close to 40%, whereas the percentage of wasted votes for the Democratic Party was over 60%. Looking at the ensemble of plans, however, we start to sampling higher wasted votes percentages for the Republican Party and lower wasted votes percentages for the Democratic Party, as an indication that the ensemble of plans are simply more fair voting outcomes. Looking at the districts in comparison to the 2011 enacted plan of the state, we can clearly see that some districts are packed in regards to both the Republican and Democratic parties. The percentage of wasted votes, however, are less pronounced for the Republican Party once compared with the wasted votes of the Democratic Party. Looking at the ensemble of plans, however, the change in wasted votes percentages is less drastic as we go from district to district, which indicates that the ensemble of plans are reflecting a more fair voting outcome per district.
We'll now shift our attention to Texas, which follows a subset of the common redistricting rules highlighted here in green, like maintaining population balance and preserving county lines. Due to Texas's current political landscape, we thought it would be timely to focus on compliance with the Voting Rights Act in the state's context. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965, prohibits states from practices that result in denying or abridging the right of US citizens to vote based on race or color. It goes on to say that a violation occurs if a political process, such as redistricting, results in unequal participation for specific groups. Thus, the VRA strictly prohibits members of a protected class from having less opportunity to participate in electing representatives of their choice. Texas in particular has a contentious history complying with the Voting Rights Act and has faced several related court cases in the past decade. Advocacy groups, both in Texas and nationwide, are concerned about protecting minority voting rights in the upcoming redistricting cycle. The upcoming cycle also aligns with substantial population growth in Texas. Over the past decade, the population has grown 15.9%, largely driven by Hispanic groups. And this has resulted in 2 new congressional seats being allocated to Texas. However, the growth has been unevenly distributed, and many counties actually have seen a declining population. As Texas considers where to place these 2 new seats, it'll be important to not only account for demographic changes and changing population patterns, but to also ensure that minority groups are fairly represented. So to decide whether a plan complies with the Voting Rights Act, analysts can consider whether the districts that are being created are effective for minority groups to achieve fair representation. Researchers at the MGG Redistricting Lab have designed a method to quantify this by considering a district to be effective if it is one where a minority preferred candidate is able to both seek nomination during the primaries as well as win the general election. So using Jerry chain, what we're able to do is examine how a VRA conscious ensemble compares to a base ensemble of plans that only considers population balance, contiguity, and county line preservation goals. As you can see in the 2 graphs, if we add an additional constraint when designing plans that preferentially selects plans with more minority effective districts, we'd be able to design plans that have 2 to 3 more minority effective districts on average based on the 2010 data. So this really highlights how vastly plans can differ if minority representation is accounted for during the design process. With this in mind, if we now think ahead to the upcoming cycle and consider options for where the 2 new districts might go, it's important for us to remember that the placement of these districts is crucial to fair representation. So what we're showing here is the difference in the average number of districts per county in our ensembles when we compare 2010 plans to 2020 plans. So the green regions are areas where we expect to see a higher number of districts in 2020 than 2010, and the brown areas are counties where we expect to see a decrease in the number of districts. So to take a deeper dive, we focused in on the Dallas metro area and the Austin metro area, which falls in Hayes and Travis counties. If we only consider the population differences over the last decade, then in the zoomed in maps on the top row, we can see green regions corresponding to areas that our ensemble analysis indicates could be likely candidates for adding a new district. However, if we build our 2020 ensemble by prioritizing adding more minority effective districts, then the landscape of options changes. For example, when only accounting for population, both Hayes and Travis counties are potential candidates for a new district. But if we want to maximize the number of minority opportunity districts, then on the bottom row, we can see that Hayes County is actually a much better option than Travis County. Similarly, it would be better to place a new district and select Dallas suburbs that are shaded in green in the second row if we want to better comply with the Voting Rights Act. As you can see, the Jerry chain library allows for nuanced analysis on possible trade-offs when considering where these new districts could be placed. So we've used these 3 case study results to inform a stakeholder guide that will help democratize the computational resources we use this summer and allow for more users to engage in these types of analysis. Working through these state-level case studies has really underscored the complexity of modeling decisions that are left to the discretion of those evaluating plans. Modelers must be able to carefully tailor their analysis to state-specific contexts. And so we've compiled our lessons learned from this summer into a guide, which can be found on our website later this week. This guide provides a set of generalizable rules for users of the Jerry chain library to apply to redistricting problems. The guide is geared towards community members, activists, and independent electoral commission members who hope to engage with the redistricting process. The guide provides an overview of using Jerry chain, and the Getting Started section covers the analysis process from data wrangling through calculating and interpreting metrics. State-level case studies provide deeper dives. This guide can accompany users through their analysis journey and provide key junctures where a user should slow down or pause to consider decision points more closely.
Ultimately, we want that the stakeholder guide can further the core principles of fairness. Our team has discussed 2 complementary and related applications of fairness in the redistricting process. The concept of fairness in terms of output, that is, are the final maps fair, and also is the map drawing process itself fair. Fairness for the process focuses on maximizing inclusion and transparency in map drawing, and the guide can serve as part of a larger effort to democratize resources, computational tools, and knowledge on this political process. In terms of outcome, we view fair maps as those that are structured for equal representation of voters. Explicitly, we define fair maps where each person's vote has the same impact as any other person, which relates to the one person, one vote view. This past Thursday, the US Census Bureau released the 2020 census results, which kicked off formal map drawing processes. So this project output and impact are very timely. As our DSSG project timeline comes to a close, the 2020 redistricting cycle is just heating up, and the stakeholder guide and case studies will equip community members with the resources they need to engage with the process more meaningfully. We'd like to thank the University of Washington eScience Institute and our sponsor, Markov, for making our work this summer possible. Thank you.